Hey everybody, Matt here from the iWall. We're going to talk a little bit about Hurricane Lee tonight. We'll focus in a little bit more on the impacts. You can go to theiwall.com to see more about this. A few changes from Hurricane Lee's status this evening. The storm surge watches that were in effect for Cape Cod Bay, for the Cape, Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, those have been dropped, discontinued. The storm surge now is expected to be about 1 to 3 feet, so that is under, warning criteria for that area. Still, certainly some minor tidal flooding is expected for parts of Massachusetts, particularly the Cape and Cape Cod Bay, just because of the wind. Wind coming out of the northeast, and the north sort of pushes the water into Cape Cod Bay. Other than that, really not any significant changes. The track forecast has stayed pretty continuous since yesterday. There have been no real modifications to that. Everything is on track. We expect Lee to gradually work its way to the north and come in probably somewhere east of Maine, more into the Bay of Fundy, Nova Scotia, somewhere in that area, possibly as far north as New Brunswick if it can get into the Bay of Fundy. We'll see about that. Well, let's talk more about some of these impacts, particularly as they go to the north, closer to where the center of the storm is going to be. Here is a map of coastal Maine right here. The orange color indicates areas that we are expecting to see basically tropical storm force sustained winds possible. That includes most of down east Maine, includes Acadia National Park, Bar Harbor, areas just inland from there, and some of the coast down toward the mid-coast of Maine, even getting in closer to the Portland area could see some tropical storm force sustained winds. Additionally, we could also see some tropical storm force wind gusts all the way inland, perhaps as far north or inland as Bangor and Augusta. Other areas across eastern Maine could see some tropical storm force winds as well. Also, some of the mountains, the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I think the observations from Mount Washington might be a little interesting. Some of the Presidential Range mountains could see some significant wind gusts as Lee passes by, as could some of the higher terrain in the Maine Highlands, some of the mountains up in Maine. We'll see exactly how that all plays out. Wind, not a huge concern, but it will be very noticeable, capable of knocking down trees, especially because it's still early in autumn. A lot of the leaves have not fallen off trees. So trees are fully leafed, and that makes them a little bit easier to knock down. So that'll be one thing that we'll be watching. Certainly some power outages, especially at the coast, maybe a little bit inland as well. Let's shift our focus more to rainfall. Rainfall totals for Hurricane Lee, not really too changed. They've been kind of wobbling a little back and forth, but generally in the 1 to 6 inch range. So as you get into western Maine, into New Hampshire, you run into about the 1 inch line, which is basically the blue-purple color here. The kind of sort of the boundary between that. That's where rainfall totals fall back below an inch. Same thing up in Quebec and off to the north from there. As you get a little bit further into Maine, you run more into 2 to 4 inch rainfall for most of southern Maine, coastal New Hampshire as well, probably about 1 to 3 inches down toward coastal Massachusetts. With the rainfall that you have had this week, certainly could see some flash flooding in parts of Massachusetts. They'll be the most vulnerable to rain. Areas in Maine should be able to handle most of this as long as it doesn't fall too quickly, but certainly some urban flooding is possible. Some flash flooding for some of the streams and creeks across Maine is also possible as well, particularly as you get into eastern Maine, sort of coast toward the coast from Bangor. Places like Bar Harbor and Acadia National Park could certainly see a little bit of flash flooding, as well as eastern Maine, Eastport, Lubec, those areas could see some flash flooding. And that those higher totals will extend into New Brunswick, so we could see some flash flooding in parts of New Brunswick as well as western Nova Scotia, maybe even a little bit of heavier rainfall up into Prince Edward Island, although I think it will lose a little bit of its bite once it gets up there. But notice how far north into Maine and even New Brunswick some of these rainfall totals go. So we will see some substantial rain across most of the state of Maine and most of New Brunswick as well. So I made this map of Canada, Atlantic Canada, to kind of underscore sort of where I think the biggest risks are right now. One of the differences between the U.S. National Weather Service and Environment Canada, both very good government agencies, but the graphics, the communication, dissemination of information from the U.S. National Weather Service is kind of light years ahead of their partners up in Canada, in my opinion. So I wanted to kind of come up with something that was along those lines, and that's what I drew here. So wherever you see the red includes most of coastal Nova Scotia, all the way up to the eastern part of Nova Scotia, as well as into the Bay of Fundy, moving toward the isthmus there. We could see some pretty substantial impacts from storm surge in those areas. Significant coastal flooding. We're probably talking about at least 1 to 3 feet of surge on top of an elevated tide going into Saturday evening. Exactly what the impacts will be will obviously vary between location, geography, things like that. There are some models that have been depicting a pretty healthy surge of water pushing into the Bay of Fundy, but I think that will ultimately depend on an exact track of Lee. I think there is, we tell you not to focus on the exact track of the storm, but a storm going in this way into Nova Scotia is a lot different than one that goes this way, particularly for the Bay of Fundy. So I think that there's still a little bit of, there are some questions yet to be answered in terms of the impacts into the Bay of Fundy. They could be very significant or they could be moderate. I think that's kind of where we're at right now. We're not going to get into a situation where there's no impacts. There certainly will be. But the surge is sort of at that border right now. We'll have to watch this closely over the next 24 hours to see what changes. but certainly significant impacts along the Nova Scotia coast. All this water is going to be funneled right into the coast of Nova Scotia. And again, depending on the track, could be funneled up into the Bay of Fundy as well. So those are the areas that we're most concerned with in terms of storm surge risk, where we see the orange is more of like a moderate type impact. Consider that something more along the lines of a significant nor'easter that you would get there, some sort of significant gale. The red indicates something a little bit above that, something more damaging potentially, more significant impacts, more long-term impacts potentially. And this would be mainly at the coast. The wind from this storm will not be quite as serious as what we've seen in some past storms like Fiona last year or Juan in 2003. And those storms went into eastern Nova Scotia as well. This one is going to come more into the west. And so the impacts will be much different than what we saw from those two sorts of storms. For folks on the northern areas, heading up toward the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Prince Edward Island, the impact should be generally what I would deem as to be minor to moderate. You will have a little bit of coastal flooding, some high tide splashover, certainly some heavy rain, certainly some gusty winds, but probably, again, more equivalent to just kind of a rough nor'easter than anything else. But certainly, as you get into Nova Scotia and the Bay of Fundy, that is more of a hurricane type impact. Lee will be a storm that will be probably memorable in those areas, whereas for some other areas, maybe not so much. Just another in a lineage of some significant storms that you typically get in those areas. So those are what we're going to be watching. We'll adjust this if we have to for tomorrow. We're following what Environment Canada says very closely. We're following what the National Hurricane Center says very closely as well. And I kind of sort of tried to synthesize that into one graphic because everybody likes simple, right? These storms are very complex. They're very difficult to explain all the hazards. But if we can synthesize it into more of a simplistic graphic like this, I think that's kind of helpful. And again, maybe not perfect. Your mileage will vary. Some parts of Nova Scotia may see worse flooding maybe from rainfall. You did have some significant rain in parts of western Nova Scotia today, up to 30 millimeters, and you'll be getting another 4 to 6 inches of rain, which is about 100 to 150 millimeters of rainfall from Lee itself as it comes in. So we'll be watching for that as well. Certainly some flooding issues in Nova Scotia, perhaps New Brunswick also. But hopefully you weather this okay. Certainly a big storm, certainly a potentially memorable storm. We'll keep tabs on it and have more for you tomorrow. Take care.